Hello to everyone. Welcome. Welcome to our in-depth study meditation on what the mystics know. This is your Pastor Yeti. We are in part 5, and today I'm going to talk about contemplation means practicing having heaven now. I hope the weekend went well to all of you, wherever you are in your time frame. I hope that you find the time to go through this in-depth, indeed contemplation, study time, an experience in your love journey as you walk with your Christ. Contemplation, the divine therapy. By contemplation we mean the deliberate seeking of God through a willingness to detach from the passing self, the tyranny of emotions, the addictions to self-image, and the false promises of this world. It is a journey into faith and nothingness. The ordinary rules of thinking, managing, explaining, and fixing up the self do not apply here. It is a search for God, a love of larger truth, and not the mere manipulation of ideas and feelings inside the private self. Contemplation is a divine therapy and the perennial clearinghouse for the soul. All the great world religions recognize its necessity in their more mature stages. For Christians, it is Jesus' sojourn in the desert for 40 days, and Mary's, "Let it be done unto me according to your word." Luke 1:38. We all need vacation, leisure time, quiet time, and reading. But these are not necessarily the contemplative journey, and sometimes they actually keep us from it by excessive self-analysis. The need to work it all out, or the desire to avoid people and problems. Introverts have no natural head start into contemplation. Their busyness and control needs just to take a different shape from those of the extrovert. It is important that we continue to clarify and hold to these two pivots of our lives. Rightly sought action and contemplation will always regulate, balance, and convert each other. Separately, they are dead-ended and trapped in personality. The gear goal of our Center for Action and Contemplation is to meet people where they are at and help them trust where they are not at. For all of us, it is an endless rhythmic dance. The step changes now and then, but someone else always lead. As Einstein said, no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. We can try to teach a contemplative stance toward life that gives people an entirely new way of knowing the world, and that has the power to move them beyond mere ideology and dualistic thinking. What religion calls contemplation is the only mind that is broad enough and deep enough to answer the real and important questions. Mature religion will always lead you to some form of prayer, meditation, or contemplative mind to balance out our usually calculative mind. Such seeing gives you the capacity to be happy and happily alone, rooted elsewhere, comfortable with paradox and mystery, and largely immune to mass consciousness and its false promises. It is called wisdom seeing. Your practice must somehow include the problem. Prayer is not the avoiding of distractions, but precisely how you deal with distractions. Contemplation is not the avoidance of the problem, but the daily merging with the problem and finding its full resolution. What you quickly and humbly learn in contemplation is that how you do anything is probably how you do everything. If you are brutal in your inner reaction to your own littleness and sinfulness, your social relationships and even your politics will probably be the same, brutal. Let me give you an example of Thérèse of Lisieux, the story of a soul. This young contemplative nun is daily dealing with her irritations, judgments, and desire to run from her fellow sisters in the convent. She faces her own mixed motives and pettiness. She is constant in her concern for those working actively in the missions. But her goal is always compassion and communion. She suffers her powerlessness until she can finally break through to love. She holds the tension within herself, the essence of contemplation, until she herself is the positive resolution of that tension. Most of us have lived our whole lives with a steady stream of consciousness, with a continually flow of ideas, images, and feelings. And at every moment of our lives, we cling to such ideas or feelings. I don't have the idea has me. I don't have a feeling, the feeling has me. We have to discover who this I really is, the one who has these feelings or these thoughts, who are we ourselves behind our thoughts and feelings. I'm sure that most people in the Western world have never really met the person who they themselves really are. Because at very moment, all our life long, we identify ourselves either with our thoughts or self-image or our feelings. We have to find a way to get behind our thoughts, feelings, and self-image. We have to discover the face that we already had before we were born. We have to find out who we were all along in God before we did anything right or wrong. This is the first goal of contemplation. I ask you to imagine a river or stream. You're sitting on the bank of this river, where boats and ships are sailing past. While the stream flows past your inner eye, I ask you to name each one of these vessels. For example, one of the boats could be called my anxiety about tomorrow. Or along comes the ship, objections to my husband. Or the boat, oh, I don't do that well. Every judgment that you pass is one of those boats. Take the time to give each one of them a name, and then let it move on. For some people, this is a very difficult exercise because we are used to jumping aboard the boats immediately. As soon as we own a boat and identify with it, it picks up energy. But what we have to practice is processing, letting go. With every idea, with every image that comes into our head, we say, no, I'm not that. I don't need that. That's not me. Again and again, we have to tell ourselves this. Some of the boats that are accustomed to our jumping aboard them immediately, think we just didn't see them the first time. That's why they head back upstream and return. The boat says, but before this he always used to get mad at his wife. Why didn't he this time? Some of you will feel the need to torpedo your boats, but don't attack them. Don't hate them or condemn them. This is also an exercise in non-violence. You aren't allowed to hate your soul. The point is to recognize things and to say, that's not necessary. I don't need that. But do it very amiably. If we learn to handle our own souls tenderly and lovingly, then we'll be able to carry this same loving wisdom into the world outside. God is being itself, but also a being that is more me than I am myself. This changes everything. God has become a Tao and not just an energy field. and I have become an I and not just a statistic. And the path is relationship itself and not just practice, discipline, or holy posture. Authentic contemplation of the other through all the necessary stages of personal relationships calls us beyond our tiny and false selves and into the self. We become the one we gaze upon, and the eyes by which we look back at God are the same eyes by which God has first looked at us. This reciprocal gaze is the true self, perfectly given and always waiting to be perfectly received. It is so dear and so precious that it needs no external payoffs whatsoever. The true self is abundantly content. Once upon a time, a small Jewish boy went to his rabbi and said he didn't know how to love God. "How can I love God when I've never seen him?" asked the boy. "I think I understand how to love my mother, my father, my brother, my sister, and even the people in our neighborhood. But I don't know how I'm supposed to love God." The rabbi looked at the little boy and said, "Start with a stone. Try to love a stone. Try to be present to the most simple and basic things in reality so you can see its goodness and beauty. Then let that goodness and beauty comes into you. Let it speak to you. Start with a stone." The boy nodded with understanding. "Then when you can love a stone," the rabbi continued, "try a flower. See if you can love a flower. See if you can be present to it and let its beauty come into you. See if you can let its life come into you and you can give yourself to it. You don't have to pluck it, possess it, or destroy it. You can just love it over there in the garden." The boy nodded again. "I'm not saying it's wrong to pick flowers," added the rabbi. "I'm just asking you to learn something from the flower within putting it in a vase." The boy smiled, which meant he understood. Or maybe he didn't. Just in case he didn't, the rabbi chose the boy's pet's dog as the next object of loving and listening. The boy nodded and smiled when the rabbi talked about his dog. He even said, "Yes, Rabbi." Then the rabbi went on, "Try to love the sky and the mountains, the beauty of all creation. Try to be present to it in its many forms. Let it speak to you and let it come into you." The boy sensed the rabbi wanted to say some more, so he nodded again, as if he understood. Then the rabbi said, "Try to love a woman. Try to be faithful to a woman and sacrifice yourself for her. After you have loved a stone, a flower, your little dog, the mountains, the sky, and a woman, then you'll be ready to love God." How lovely and how true. Too many people have tried to short circuit the process of learning to love God, instead of starting with a stone and working their way up to God. They quickly pretend to have some immediate contact with divine revelation. I don't want to discourage anyone from running to God, but some people don't yet know how to run or how to love the stones. They don't yet know how to perceive, how to be faithful, how to sacrifice, how to see without trying to control. They probably try to control because, like the rest of us, they feel weak, alienated, and out of communion with reality. But control never works in the spiritual life. The undergoing passion teaches more than the fixing and explanation action. People with little or no patience for communing with stones, flowers, pets, or human beings will probably not have much more patience communing directly with God. They will most likely distort the revelation of God and use it for their own purposes. The false, egocentric self, disconnected from union, will be unable to see things correctly or enjoy them for themselves. The fragmented person seems to fragment everything else. The reconnected person sees rightly and, not surprisingly, sees God too. As soon as we distance ourselves from the control center of our brains, as soon as we see ourselves from the comfortable principles of our preconceived theology, as soon as we've gotten to the point where we know only that we actually know nothing, then the transcendent can reach out. Then we are no longer caught in the myth of reason, the myth of science. Then we open to the non-rational as well, to grace, to the transcendent, to the burning bush. It's all a matter of seeing. Unless we learn to let go of our feelings, we don't have the feelings have us. We have to ask, who is the I that has these feelings? The spiritual journey leads us back to this, I. But most men and women in the West have never encountered it. Instead, they've become identified with their stream of consciousness, with their feelings. I'm not saying that you should suppress and deny your feelings. I'm challenging you to name them, identify them, and observe them. But don't fight them and don't identify with them. Teaching this art is teaching contemplative prayer in its first stages. Now you might ask, what does this have to do with God? I thought prayer was supposed to be talking to God or searching for God. You seem to be saying that prayer is first of all about me and getting myself out of the way. That is exactly what I am saying. God is already present. God's Spirit is dwelling within you. You cannot search for what you already have. You cannot talk God into coming into you by longing and more urgent prayers. All you can do is become quieter, smaller, and less filled with your own self and its flurry of ideas and feelings. Then God will be obvious in the very now of things. Allow God to be our God is not something we can do as easily as believing this, doing that, attending this, or avoiding that. It is always a process of a lifetime, a movement toward union that will always feel like a loss of self-importance and autonomy. The private ego will resist and rationalize in every way that it can. My experience is that apart from suffering, failure, humiliation, and pain, none of us will naturally let go of our self-sufficiency. We will think that our story is just about us. It isn't. My significance comes from who I am in God, who I am as part of a much larger whole. I am somehow a representative of God, and God is carrying me, both the good and the bad parts. I'm back. I was not contemplating, okay? I was charging my Kindle. So I hope you're all there. That's why it took so long to plug it back in and to have some battery going. Anyway, let us not keep this off track. That's where we were in contemplative surrender. Contemplation in non-mystified language is the ability to meet reality in its most simple and direct form. When I let go of my judgment, my agenda, my tyrannical emotive life, my attachment to my positive or negative self-image, I am naked, poor, and ready for the big truth. Without some form of contemplative surrendering, I see little hope for breakthrough, for new ground, for moving beyond the hysterical ideologies of left and right, the small mind and the clutching ego. People have different temperaments and different rhythms, and you have to discover how to pray according to your own rhythm and temperament. For some, perhaps Tuesday afternoon from 1 o'clock to 5 is going to be their prayer time, because during this practical time slot they can slow down, take off, and drive to the country or whatever it might be. For others, it is absolutely important to start every day with prayer. They don't feel right all day if they don't get up early and spend half an hour in prayer. For some, prayer time is after supper. For others, it's after their kids are asleep or before they go out of bed in the morning. Still others take 2 days a month for retreat to saturate themselves with prayer. That, of course, doesn't mean they are not seeking communion with the Lord throughout the week. There is no need to feel guilty about when, how, and often you formally pray. As you come to understand your own temperament, you will understand your way to pray. Those of us whose minds are always racing might need to Jesus beads or the rosary. That is, of course, of your choice. I'm not a person who will reach out to a rosary. For some, doing that, all repetitions leaves the mind barren, and thereby open to another mind. Doers, however, need liturgical prayer, where we can kneel, stand, sit, move around, eat, drink, and shake hands. Walking meditation, for example, took the form of processions or the Stations of the Cross. And there's so much more. So much more. Those who are primarily beers, B-E-E-R-S, may need a prayer of quiet. We may need charismatic and contemplative prayer form that move beyond images. Or we may need prayer that employs our fantasy, imagination, and memory. These three faculties have been neglected in our spiritual tradition. In much Christian meditations, we tend to emphasize the faculties of our mind, exercising the memory, intellect, and will. Often we read our prayers from a printed page, which is fine for liturgical assemblies, as long as it does not become an avoiding of spontaneous prayer from the heart. In the course of our lives, we will likely move between these different prayer forms at different stages of our journey. On the way to contemplation, we do that same thing that Jesus Christ did in the wilderness. Jesus teaches us not to say, Lord, Lord, but to do the will of his Father. What must primarily concern us is that we do what Jesus has bidden us to do. Jesus went into the wilderness, eat nothing for 40 days, and made himself empty. Another image of that emptiness is the body of Mary. She can receive Jesus into that emptiness and bear Christ to the world because she is his poor handmaid. The incarnation had nothing to do with theology. It was rather about vulnerability, about letting go, about emptiness, about self-surrender. And none of that is in the head. It was a woman who said yes so that Jesus could come into the world. And the more the church gets out of its head and into its feminine soul, the more, I believe, it will become able to conceive Christ and carry him to term for the world. Not a Christ to fight over as Catholics or Protestants, as liberals and conservatives, but simply a Christ we can meet, a Christ we can stumble on, a Christ who won't let people know him, only love him. Some are convinced God is playing a game with them. When we experience God playing a game with us, we instinctively play another game, which is called religion. How long, O Lord, is our attitude? How long do we have to put up with this? This pattern never seems to change until we encounter intimate love. But the good news is that we are still producing mystics. People are always falling in love with God, especially after they recognize that God loved them when they were unloved. God trusted them when they could not trust himself, and God forgave them when no one else would. It is much easier to belong to a group than to belong to God. To belong to a group, one usually has to be convinced the group is right. To belong to God, one always knows one is as wrong as everybody else. Everything exposed to the light itself becomes light, says Ephesians 5:14. In prayer we merely keep returning the divine gaze and we become its reflection, almost in spite of selves. The word prayer has often been trivialized by making it into a way of getting what you want. I use prayer as the umbrella word for any interior journeys, as practices that allows you to experience faith, hope, and love within yourself. It is not a technique for getting things, a pious exercise that somehow makes God happy, or a requirement for entry into heaven. It is much more like practicing having now. what we experience when we identify with the Beloved. This is the achievement of the saints and mystics. Is not, I love you by choice or devotion, but I am you. That's the identification that happens on the spiritual journey. As Jesus put it, I and the Father are one. The object of devotion is not even out there anymore. It has been so taken in that I am over there, and the over there is in here. God, it seems, cannot really be known, but only related to, or as the mystics would assert, we know God by loving God, by trusting God, by placing our hope in God. It is a non-possessive, non-objectified way of knowing. It is always I though and never I it. To us, to use Martin Buber's wonderfully insightful phrases, God allows us to know Him only by loving Him. God in that sense cannot be thought. So, sorry again for the feeling that we were doing some exercise when I was looking for a charging cord. But anyway, what happened in that very quiet moment, we never know. The only one who knows it is the one who took that moment as a contemplative experience. Anyway, there's a lot here. A lot of food to work with. I like the experience of sitting on a rock or on a bench or whatever I feel most comfortable on the ocean. And let the ships pass by and don't forget to name Him. And I will remember that myself too. May God bless you and protect you. May He help you to be contemplative in the way that you just heard, that He is in you and the Spirit is in you. God is with you. He walks with you right here. And God bless you. May you go for the next? Okay. Have a very wonderful day. Bye-bye.